this episode, we are going to take the idea of managed services and cloud services and explore how to govern them so security is built in from the start rather than bolted on after a problem appears. Beginners often hear cloud and think the provider handles security, and they hear managed service and think the vendor is now responsible for everything. In reality, these services change where work happens, who touches your data, and how decisions are made, which means governance becomes even more important, not less. Governance is the system of roles, rules, and decision paths that ensures the organization knows what it is buying, knows how risk is being managed, and can prove that expectations are being met over time. When services are external, visibility can decrease and dependency can increase. So the organization must compensate with clear requirements, clear accountability, and steady oversight. Security built-in means that security requirements are part of selection, contracting, onboarding, and ongoing operations, rather than being added as emergency fixes. It also means the organization understands what it must still do itself, because shared responsibility does not disappear just because the service is managed. When you learn to govern these services properly, you reduce surprise risk, reduce incident confusion, and protect mission outcomes that depend on providers you do not control directly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong place to start is understanding why governance is harder with managed and cloud services, even though these services often make technology easier to consume. Managed and cloud services are appealing because they reduce the burden of maintaining infrastructure and because they can scale quickly, but they also create a dependency relationship where your availability, data protection, and response speed may depend on another organization. That dependency introduces risk that is not always technical, such as slow communication during incidents, unclear boundaries of responsibility, and contractual gaps that limit your ability to demand evidence. Beginners sometimes focus only on provider reputation, but reputation is not a control, and governance is what turns a service into a controlled relationship. Governance also matters because cloud services introduce rapid change, meaning providers update features, configurations, and interfaces frequently, and those changes can affect security posture. If the organization does not have governance to monitor and manage change, it can drift into insecurity without noticing. With managed services, governance matters because providers often perform actions on your behalf, such as monitoring, patching, or incident response, and you must ensure those actions align with your policies and risk tolerance. In both cases, governance is the bridge between external capabilities and internal accountability. Without that bridge, the organization becomes dependent without control. An essential beginner concept here is shared responsibility, because security built-in depends on understanding what the provider does and what the customer must still do. Shared responsibility means that certain layers of security are handled by the provider and certain layers remain the customer's responsibility, and the boundary varies by service type. For example, a provider may secure the underlying infrastructure, but the customer may still be responsible for configuring access, classifying data, and defining who can do what. A managed service provider may monitor and respond, but the customer may still be responsible for defining acceptable risk, approving containment actions, and meeting reporting obligations. Beginners often assume shared responsibility is obvious, but it is frequently misunderstood, and misunderstanding leads to gaps where nobody owns a control. Governance resolves this by defining responsibilities clearly and by requiring evidence that responsibilities are being met. Security built-in means shared responsibility is addressed during selection and onboarding, not discovered during an incident. It also means responsibilities are communicated to internal teams so they know what they must do to keep the service secure. When shared responsibility is clear, teams can act confidently instead of guessing and hoping. Governance starts before the service is even chosen, because the selection process is where you establish security requirements and reject options that cannot meet them. This does not mean security becomes the department of no. It means security helps define what is necessary to protect data and operations. Requirements might include access control expectations, logging and monitoring support, incident notification timelines, data residency or data handling expectations, and the ability to provide audit evidence. The selection process should also consider service criticality, because critical services may require stronger resilience commitments and more rigorous oversight. Beginners sometimes assume that security evaluation happens after procurement, but late evaluation creates expensive rework and forces uncomfortable compromises. Early evaluation allows the organization to choose providers that fit its risk tolerance and to negotiate terms before dependency is created. This is also where you consider how the service will integrate with identity, monitoring, and data classification practices, because integration is where many risks are introduced. If a provider cannot integrate into your control points, you lose visibility and control. Governance and selection is therefore a way to preserve control points even when the service is external. Once a provider is selected, governance continues through contracting, and contracting is where security requirements become enforceable commitments. A contract should clarify roles, responsibilities, reporting, and escalation, and it should define what evidence the provider will supply. For managed services, contracts should define what actions the provider can take, what actions require approval, and how coordination happens during incidents. For cloud services, contracts should define service availability commitments, support response expectations, and what happens when changes occur that affect security. Beginners sometimes think contracts are legal-only documents, but they are operational controls because they define what you can demand and what you can verify. Contract language also affects accountability. If a provider fails to meet commitments, what remedies exist, and what obligations remain. Security built-in means contracts reflect the organization's policy requirements and external obligations, such as incident notification timelines. If a contract cannot meet those obligations, the organization may still be responsible and therefore at risk. Governance includes ensuring contract terms do not create hidden compliance gaps. When contracts are aligned and enforceable, they provide the foundation for ongoing oversight. Onboarding is the stage where security often quietly fails if governance is not disciplined, because onboarding is where the service is connected to the organization's environment. Onboarding includes setting up identity and access, configuring logging, establishing monitoring, defining who can administer the service, and ensuring data classification and handling requirements are applied. Beginners sometimes assume onboarding is technical setup, but governance is also needed to ensure onboarding follows the agreed requirements and that responsibilities are assigned. For example, who approves access, who reviews permissions, and who confirms that logging is actually working. Onboarding should also include incident coordination setup, such as contact points, escalation paths, and communication expectations, because incident response is much harder to coordinate if relationships are not established in advance. Security built-in means that these items are treated as required deliverables, not optional best practices. When onboarding is governed, the organization begins with a known security posture rather than a hope-based posture. This reduces the risk of early incidents and creates evidence that the organization followed its own controls. Ongoing governance is where managed and cloud services either become a stable asset or a growing risk because time introduces drift. Drift happens when configurations change, when permissions expand, when providers update features, or when internal teams bypass processes under pressure. Governance counters drift by establishing regular review activities such as access reviews, configuration reviews, monitoring checks, and performance reporting. For managed services, governance includes reviewing provider activity, ensuring actions are within scope, and validating that incidents are handled according to expectations. For cloud services, governance includes monitoring for insecure configurations and ensuring security baselines are maintained as teams deploy new resources. Beginners sometimes assume the provider will alert them to security issues, but providers often focus on their layer of responsibility and may not detect misconfigurations caused by customer settings. This is why governance must include internal checks, even when services are managed. Security built-in means governance routines are planned and resourced, not treated as extra work that can be skipped. When routines exist, problems are detected early and corrected before they become incidents. A key governance challenge is balancing agility and control because cloud services enable rapid change and managed services can enable rapid operational action. If governance is too slow, teams will bypass it to move forward, creating shadow use and uncontrolled risk. If governance is too loose, misconfigurations and uncontrolled access will accumulate, creating risk that is hard to unwind. Mature governance uses clear decision boundaries and automation where possible, so the secure path stays fast. Decision boundaries might include which actions are pre-approved, which actions require review, and which actions require escalation. For example, routine changes might follow a standard process, while high-risk changes require additional review. Managed service actions might be pre-authorized for certain types of monitoring responses, but require explicit approval for disruptive actions like shutting down services. This approach allows speed with accountability, rather than speed through chaos. Beginners sometimes think governance equals slowing down, but good governance can increase speed by reducing uncertainty and by preventing rework. When teams know the rules and the approval paths, they can plan effectively. Security built-in also depends on maintaining visibility, because you cannot govern what you cannot see. Visibility includes knowing what assets exist, what data is stored where, who has access, and what activity is occurring. With cloud services, visibility is often challenging because resources can be created quickly and distributed widely across teams. With managed services, visibility can be challenging because actions may happen in provider systems or through provider personnel. Governance, therefore, includes requirements for logging, reporting, and auditability. It also includes ensuring that the organization can retrieve relevant information during incidents, because incident response depends on timely access to evidence. Beginners sometimes assume that because a service is external, evidence will be easy to obtain, but evidence access varies widely by provider and service tier. Governance must ensure that evidence expectations are defined and that the organization has the right level of access to perform oversight. Visibility is also tied to accountability because reports are how you verify performance and compliance. Without visibility, you are trusting rather than governing. In conclusion, governing managed services and cloud services with security built in is about creating a controlled relationship where external capabilities support organizational goals without creating hidden, unmanaged dependency risk. Effective governance begins early in selection by defining security requirements and choosing providers that can meet them, continues through contracting by converting requirements into enforceable commitments, and becomes real during onboarding by integrating identity, logging, and responsibilities in a disciplined way. Ongoing governance counters drift through regular reviews, performance reporting, and validation of shared responsibility boundaries, ensuring security posture remains stable as services and configurations change. Balanced governance enables agility by using clear decision boundaries and practical processes that teams can follow without constant friction. Visibility and evidence are essential because oversight depends on knowing what exists, who has access, and how incidents are handled. When governance is mature, managed and cloud services become reliable enablers rather than unpredictable risk multipliers, and security becomes a built-in characteristic of how the organization consumes external services.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.